The Galactic Council gathered in solemn arrogance, their chamber a vast cathedral of authority, suspended above a dying star. Beneath its luminous glow, 1,000 voices murmured in a dozen alien tongues, deliberating on matters they deemed significant. The topic today, however, was met with condescension. Humanity. A species so unremarkable, so crude in their technological development, that their very mention invited scoffs from the more ancient races. And yet, here they were, an issue demanding resolution. High Speaker Zywantol of the Ilari, a species with a lineage traced back 1,000,000 years, tapped a clawed finger against the polished stone of his podium. A ripple of silence spread through the chamber. His multifaceted eyes glowed with authority as he addressed the assembled counselors. "It is unfortunate," he began, voice smooth as oil, "that we must waste time on a species so insignificant. But their defiance is troubling." A low, guttural growl emerged from the Varkesh delegation, their warlord representative shifting his massive, armored frame. The Varkesh were conquerors by nature, towering, four-armed behemoths who had crushed civilizations beneath their iron grip for millennia. "Troubling?" Warlord Karnath sneered. "This is not troubling. It is an insult. We gave them the customary demand of submission. They did not answer. That is a declaration of war." A murmur of agreement rolled through the chamber, save for a few cautious diplomats. The Council had absorbed thousands of species into its fold, some through diplomacy, many through force. Compliance was expected. Submission was law. The humans, however, had responded with silence. "Perhaps they are too primitive to comprehend our transmission," suggested Councillor Belron of the Silith, a race of scholars whose neural networks surpassed even artificial intelligence. His voice carried an undertone of amusement. "Their ships are barely capable of interstellar travel. It is likely they failed to interpret our message altogether." "Unlikely," came the measured voice of an older counselor, his blue-gray skin marked with the sigils of the Turvis, an ancient observer race. He gestured, and a holoscreen flickered to life above the chamber, displaying centuries of human history, compressed into a brutal montage. Wars, revolutions, empires rising and falling, humanity's timeline was painted in blood and fire. "They have never been a species that kneels," he continued. "Even among their own kind, submission is not their nature. When pressed, they fight. And they fight well." The chamber darkened momentarily as holographic projections illustrated human warfare, from crude slug throwers to devastating orbital weapons. The sheer frequency of their conflicts dwarfed even the most aggressive council species. They did not fight merely to conquer, they fought for ideals, for vengeance, for survival. It was an unnerving sight, but High Speaker Zywantol was unmoved. "Whatever savagery they exhibit among themselves is irrelevant," he dismissed. "Their fleets are inferior. Their worlds are few. If they have chosen silence, then they have chosen annihilation." Karnath grinned, his fang maw splitting into something resembling pleasure. "Then let us proceed with extermination." The chamber erupted into a storm of voices, some in favor of immediate invasion, others advocating patience. The Yulari preferred assimilation through control. Humans would make fine servants if properly subjugated. The Varkesh desired conquest, the simple pleasure of breaking a species beneath their might. A final vote was cast. The decision was unanimous. Humanity would receive one final demand. If they refused to comply, their worlds would burn. The message was crafted with practiced efficiency, a transmission sent on every frequency humanity could detect. There was no room for misinterpretation. Submit or be destroyed. The Galactic Council waited, certain that within days, Earth's leaders would kneel. They had seen this before. Weaker civilizations always resisted at first, but fear inevitably took hold. The sheer scale of the Council's military might was enough to bring even the proudest species to their knees. But the days passed. Then weeks. No response. Silence. It was unheard of. Even the most rebellious species at least attempted negotiation, desperate to preserve themselves. Yet humanity offered nothing. No pleas, no protests, no threats, just an unbroken, deafening silence. Confusion rippled through the council. Some questioned if their transmission had even been received, but the Tervis confirmed it had. Then why do they not respond? Councillor Belron demanded. What are they waiting for? A question no one could answer. Tension coiled tighter with each passing day. Spies sent to infiltrate human networks found nothing, no signs of panic, no evacuations, no preparations for surrender. Humanity continued as if the Galactic Council did not exist. And then, on the eve of the Council's declaration of war, a single, unencrypted transmission finally arrived. It was not an apology. It was not a plea for peace. It was a set of coordinates. No message. No explanation. Just numbers. The chamber buzzed with speculation. Were they surrendering? Was this a meeting place? A last-ditch attempt at diplomacy? Carneth scowled at the data. This is meaningless. A desperate ploy to stall their destruction. Let us crush them now. But curiosity got the better of them. The Council sent reconnaissance fleets to the given location, deep in unclaimed space, far from any human colony. And there, waiting in the void, was a fleet. Not a diplomatic envoy. Not a small defensive force. A fleet so vast it eclipsed the light of the distant star behind it. Ships, uncountable in number, arrayed in perfect, disciplined formation. No sleek elegance, no wasted design, just armor, firepower, and purpose. A single message accompanied the display. We do not answer to tyrants. The Council had spent centuries believing they were the apex force in the galaxy. They had fought wars, toppled empires, crushed rebellions before they could take root. Their rule was absolute. But in that moment, as they stared at the silent, immovable armada of Earth, a single truth sank into their bones with suffocating finality. Humanity had not ignored them. Humanity had been waiting. The Galactic Council chamber, once a place of assured dominance, now pulsed with an undercurrent of unease. The silence from Earth was no longer seen as an oversight. It was deliberate. For the first time in centuries, a demand of submission had not been met with fear, diplomacy, or defiance, it had been ignored. Days stretched into weeks. The Council's finest analysts combed through every available human transmission, searching for any indication that their message had been acknowledged. There was none. No formal rejection, no outrage, not even mockery. It was as if the ultimatum had never been received at all. The Varkesh warlords took this silence as an affront. Their fleets mobilized, weapons primed, waiting for the Council's order to strike. To them, humanity's lack of response was not patience or strategy, it was insolence. Among the more bureaucratic species, theories emerged. Perhaps humans were engaging in psychological warfare, trying to provoke hesitation through silence. The Yulari found the idea laughable. Primitive species had tried such tactics before, but none had ever possessed the strength to follow through. The Council always won. Yet uncertainty gnawed at them. The Tervis, the Council's oldest and most methodical species, reviewed the situation with meticulous caution. Their archives held no precedent for a species so utterly dismissive of the Council's presence. Even the most defiant civilizations had at least acknowledged the demand. The gathered fleets stationed at the fringes of human space reported no activity. No mass evacuations, no emergency mobilization, no attempts to negotiate for survival. The humans were not preparing for war. Or, perhaps worse, they already had. Councillor Belron of the Silith brought forward data that should have been impossible. Across human-controlled space, industrial production had increased tenfold, but not in the expected areas. There were no signs of rushed ship construction or last-minute fortifications. Instead, logistical routes had expanded, and resource consumption had shifted. Supply chains across human territory had adjusted as if they were following a plan written years, if not decades, in advance. Something was wrong. Warlord Carneth dismissed the findings. To him, logistics were irrelevant. There was only one truth: humanity had refused to kneel, and war was inevitable. The only question left was when the Council would give the order. Before that decision could be made, the humans answered. It came as a single transmission, unencrypted, sent directly to the Council's primary communication hub. The message contained no introductions, no greetings, and no explanations. It was a set of coordinates. The chamber fell into stunned silence. No threats. No demands. Just numbers. Karnas scoffed at the display, calling it a delaying tactic, but not all were so quick to dismiss the implications. The coordinates pointed to a deep space location, unclaimed territory, far from any known human settlement. The Council's initial assumption was that it was a designated meeting place for negotiations, though some entertained the possibility that it was a trap. Despite their arrogance, the Council was not foolish. A single reconnaissance fleet was dispatched, led by the most advanced sensor ships in their arsenal. If the humans had prepared an ambush, they would detect it long before falling into any engagement. The fleet reached the coordinates with precision. Their instruments, designed to pierce cloaking fields and detect even the faintest energy signatures, swept the surrounding void. At first, there was nothing. The system appeared empty, a stretch of cold space with no planets, no stars, and no signs of movement. Then, their readings changed. A distortion rippled across their sensors, a gravitational anomaly where none should exist. Moments later, their systems flooded with data, objects emerging from the black, unmasking themselves as they powered up. A fleet. Not a mere assembly of warships, but a formation of staggering size and discipline. The Council's greatest military fleets were vast, numbering in the thousands, enough to overwhelm any lesser civilization through sheer force. But what their scouts had discovered dwarfed even their mightiest armadas. Human ships filled the void in perfect order, rows upon rows of vessels designed not for diplomacy, not for aesthetics, but for a singular purpose: war. Their designs lacked the flowing architecture of the Council's fleets, favoring brutal efficiency over elegance. These were machines of battle, armored behemoths that exuded readiness. The Council's analysts scrambled to make sense of the readings. The ships were unlike anything they had catalogued. Some bore the recognizable form of previous human warships, but heavily modified, reinforced far beyond their original specifications. Others were entirely new, their forms stark and unfamiliar, their weapons systems undisclosed. Most disturbing of all was their silence. There were no hails, no attempts at communication. The fleet simply waited, perfectly aligned, engines humming at a steady pace. They had seen the Council's scouts arrive, yet they did not react with hostility or inquiry. They simply existed as an undeniable presence. The lead scout vessel relayed its findings to the Council chamber in real time. The gathered representatives stared at the unfolding data in stunned disbelief. Humanity had not ignored them. Humanity had been waiting. For how long, none could say. The production shifts, the restructured logistics. This was not a last-minute preparation. This was planning. This was foresight. This was something far worse than defiance. This was inevitability. A second transmission arrived, broadcasting across every channel, reaching not just the Council's leadership but every member species capable of receiving it. 7 words. We do not answer to tyrants. The meaning was clear. There would be no surrender. No negotiations. No attempts to plead for mercy or broker peace. The silence had not been uncertainty. It had not been hesitation. It had been the patience of a species that already knew the outcome. Panic rippled through the Council's ranks. Some urged for immediate diplomacy, others demanded retaliation. The Varkesh pushed for an instant, overwhelming assault, claiming that hesitation would only embolden humanity further. But the truth had already settled in the minds of those who understood warfare beyond posturing and pride. This was no act of desperation from a weak species standing on the edge of extinction. This was a demonstration. A warning. And for the first time, the Galactic Council was forced to consider a question they had never entertained. What if they were not the superior force in the galaxy? What if humanity had never been the ones at a disadvantage? What if the Council had been playing into their hands from the very beginning? The chamber, once filled with certainty and arrogance, now carried the weight of an unspoken realization. The war they had been so eager to start was no longer a conquest. It was a reckoning. The Galactic Council had never hesitated before. The moment a species refused to kneel, their fate was sealed, crushed beneath the weight of overwhelming military force. It was a process as old as the Council itself, a perfected system of conquest and assimilation. But now, hesitation gripped them. The presence of the human fleet had disrupted everything. There were no cries for peace, no desperate defenses, no scattered resistance. Humanity had not braced for extinction, they had simply waited. And that waiting had been enough to unnerve the Council in a way no species ever had. Warlord Karnath, ever the embodiment of Varkesh aggression, refused to accept the implications. To him, war was decided not by psychological games or silent posturing, but by strength. And strength was something the Council possessed in abundance. "The time for patience is over," he declared. "We strike now, with everything we have. Before they move first." A faction of the Council agreed, driven by fear masquerading as confidence. The Council's fleets still held numerical superiority. Their war doctrine had crushed countless civilizations. To hesitate now was to acknowledge that humanity had dictated the pace of this conflict. But among the oldest and most calculating minds of the Council, doubt festered. The Turvis, masters of observation, had seen wars unfold over millennia. And this was no ordinary standoff. "This is not defiance," one of their elder counselors stated. "This is preparation. The humans are not reacting. They are executing a plan." A chilling thought settled in the chamber. What if the war had already begun? What if humanity's silence had not been a refusal to acknowledge the Council's power, but a confirmation that they had never feared it to begin with? Still, the decision was made. The largest fleet the Council had ever assembled was dispatched, a force capable of wiping out entire star systems. If humanity wished to test their might, they would be crushed under it. As the war armada entered human space, their sensors stretched across the void, searching for resistance. They expected ambushes, last-ditch defenses, anything that suggested humanity had prepared for war. What they found instead was nothing. Humanity had not deployed defensive fleets. There were no minefields, no energy barriers, no desperate garrisons waiting for the inevitable slaughter. The worlds they approached were fully functional, trade lanes intact, orbital stations operating as if war was a distant concern. It was unnatural. No species facing annihilation behaved this way. The fleet proceeded cautiously, suspecting deception. The Varkesh commanders, eager to draw first blood, launched a coordinated assault on a colony world. Planetary defenses activated, but they were insufficient against the overwhelming firepower of the Council's dreadnoughts. The first world fell in hours. A declaration of strength. A reminder of what happened to those who opposed the Council. And yet humanity still did not react. There were no distress signals, no retaliation, no desperate transmissions pleading for aid. The Council's ships stood in eerie silence above the smoldering remains, awaiting some form of response. It never came. Across human space, the pattern repeated. Planets fell, but the response was not one of a civilization collapsing under the weight of war. It was methodical. Supply lines remained intact. Reinforcements never arrived because none were ever sent. Human territories did not scramble in chaotic defense. They remained structured, almost indifferent. And then, the reports came in. Something was wrong. The planets the Council had taken had been abandoned. Not in panic, not in retreat, but in advanced preparation. Essential industries had been relocated. Strategic assets were gone. Civilian populations had been evacuated in perfect order, long before the first shots were ever fired. Humanity had not been caught off guard. They had moved ahead of the Council's attack as if they had foreseen it from the beginning. A slow realization crept through the war fleet. They were not conquering, they were chasing ghosts. Then, the real war began. Without warning, entire Council fleets went dark. Not destroyed, not attacked, just silent. Communication ceased. Long-range scans detected nothing. Entire battle groups vanished without a trace. Panic surged through the Council's ranks. Fleets were redirected, attempts were made to recover lost forces. But every effort ended the same way: silence. Then came the first transmission. Human. Broadcasted on all frequencies. A single sentence. "You are not hunting us." And suddenly, the war changed. It was not fought in grand battles where fleets clashed in open combat. It was not a contest of brute strength, of raw firepower. It was something far worse. The Council's supply chains collapsed overnight. Ships found themselves cut off from reinforcements, stranded as fuel depots and resupply stations mysteriously ceased operation. Coordination between war fleets faltered as entire communication networks fell into disarray. Human ships did not engage in direct battle unless it was necessary. Instead, they appeared where they should not have been, striking with brutal precision, then vanishing before retaliation could even be considered. They did not move like an empire at war. They moved like an executioner, carrying out a sentence long decided. And then the Council's homeworlds came under siege. Not through bombardment. Not through invasion. Through silence. Trade routes collapsed as shipping vessels disappeared without a trace. Manufacturing centers ground to a halt, not through attack, but through the systematic erasure of their infrastructure. Council species accustomed to power suddenly found themselves facing shortages they had never imagined: food, medicine, raw materials, all vanishing as if the galaxy itself was closing in on them. And still, humanity said nothing. The Council, for the first time in its existence, was afraid. The fleets they had sent to break humanity had become tombs, their forces reduced to isolated remnants, waiting for an attack that never came. The Council's greatest warriors, the Varkesh, raged at the lack of direct combat. They were not being given the dignity of war, they were being erased, piece by piece, without ever seeing their enemy. It was not a battle. It was a culling. The Council had ruled the galaxy for millennia, dictating the fates of countless species. They had crushed those who resisted, absorbed those who submitted, and stood unchallenged for generations. Now they were the ones being dictated to. And the message was clear. This was not a war they could win. This was a war humanity had already won before the first shot had even been fired. The collapse was undeniable. What had begun as a campaign of conquest had unraveled into a slow, inevitable demise. The Galactic Council, once the unquestioned authority of the known galaxy, now found itself trapped in a war it could no longer control. The silence of humanity was no longer an enigma, it was a weapon. A force more effective than any fleet, more devastating than any superweapon. It infected the Council like a virus, dismantling them from within, turning their own systems against them. The first to break were the outer colonies. Species who had long lived under the Council's rule found themselves abandoned. Supply lines had dried up. Military support had vanished. What was once a sign of strength, an empire that spanned the stars, was now a weakness. The very size of the Council made it vulnerable. The greater its reach, the more fragile it became under precise, surgical strikes. The humans never wasted resources on meaningless destruction. They didn't obliterate planets. They didn't massacre civilians. They didn't need to. They simply made sure the Council could no longer sustain itself. Entire species, once loyal to the Council out of fear or necessity, now faced starvation, economic collapse, and a growing realization: the Council was no longer in control. And in the absence of control, rebellion took root. The first open defection came from the Kelsari. Once a minor species, they had spent centuries under the Council's thumb, forced to provide resources in exchange for protection. Now, that protection was gone. The moment the Council's fleets failed to defend them, they declared independence. No threats. No war declarations. They simply severed all ties. More followed. The Zelvath. The Morik. The Varesh Dominion. What the humans had begun with military precision now evolved into something greater, a systemic collapse of the Council's authority. The Council, once confident in its power, now found itself on the defensive, not against a superior military force, but against the truth it could not ignore. It was no longer feared. Desperation set in. Messages were sent to the remaining fleets, urging them to regroup, to hold their positions. But the fleets had already fractured. Some had vanished entirely, erased by human operations that left no survivors. Others, stranded and leaderless, were forced to make their own decisions. And one by one they surrendered. Not in battle. Not through force. They simply accepted the inevitable. Council warships that had once been symbols of power now drifted into human-controlled space with deactivated weapons and silent comms. No negotiations were needed. The crews understood that resistance meant annihilation. Surrender meant survival. The Council's leadership, once so secure in their dominance, found themselves isolated. Their homeworlds, once the beating heart of a galactic empire, now suffocated under the same silence they had once dismissed. They were trapped. Not by blockades, not by invasions, but by absence. They had built an empire on the assumption that no force could rival them. But humanity had never sought to rival them. They had dismantled them. Not through war. Not through destruction. Through inevitability. And now, for the first time since their reign began, the Council faced a question they had never prepared for. What happens when the rulers of the galaxy are no longer the ones in control? The Council's chambers, once the center of galactic authority, were now suffocated by silence. The once mighty rulers, who had dictated the fate of entire civilizations, now sat in a room filled with unanswered questions and unspoken fear. Messages were still being sent, orders still issued, but nothing changed. Their fleets were lost. Their territories had splintered. Their influence had crumbled. The Council's final hope rested in negotiation. They had waged war against countless species, crushed entire empires, and never once considered the possibility of needing to surrender. But now, faced with extinction not by fire, but by quiet inevitability, they were left with no other choice. The first message of surrender was sent directly to human space. It was formal, crafted with the weight of an empire that still clung to its pride. The Council offered to recognize humanity as an equal power. They spoke of coexistence, of shared influence, of a truce that could benefit both sides. For the first time in history, they were the ones pleading. The response came swiftly. A single transmission, just like before. There will be no council. The weight of those words crushed whatever hope remained. Humanity was not offering coexistence. They were not offering terms. They were not looking to rule in the Council's place. They were erasing the concept entirely. For millennia, the Council had assumed that every species sought power, that every civilization aimed to rule. But humanity had never played by those rules. Their war had not been one of conquest, it had been one of removal. The Council had ruled because it had been allowed to. It had survived because no species had been willing to burn it to the ground. Until now. Panic spread through the remnants of the Council's leadership. Some refused to accept the truth and attempted to flee, hoping to carve out safe havens in distant systems. None made it far. The silence continued its slow, methodical work. Council homeworlds fell, not to bombardment, but to a reality they could no longer escape. Without fleets, without allies, without fear to keep the galaxy in line, they were nothing. And then, humanity made its final move. Across former Council territories, transmissions spread. Messages not of conquest, not of governance, but of liberation. The Council is no more. It was not a claim of power. It was a simple fact. The moment the words were spoken, the last remnants of the old order dissolved. Species that had once lived under the Council's rule now governed themselves. Some formed alliances, some isolated themselves, some sought humanity's guidance, but none feared the return of their former masters. Because their former masters no longer existed. Humanity never declared victory. They never raised a flag over a conquered world. They never claimed the throne that had been left empty. They had come, not to rule, but to remove. And when their work was done, they vanished. The silence remained, but now it carried a new meaning. It was not the silence of an empire crumbling under its own arrogance. It was the silence of a galaxy that had been freed.